Today's daf is Peiches, and we'll start on the top of the daf. This is a hashlama of what we started yesterday with regard to the question of the avir, the airspace above the mizbeach, and whether or not that airspace has the same status as the mizbeach itself, which would mean that if a carbon that was disqualified was in the airspace above the Mizbeach, then we apply the principle of im olu lo yard. So the Gemara asks the following question: Chatos ha'of psula hechi maza midama. If, let's say, a chatos ha'of became disqualified for whatever reason, and now the question is, do we say that since it's on the Mizbeach, therefore im olu lo yerdu, and he should go ahead and do the hazah of the chatas ha'of? But how could we apply that principle since the avoda of the chatas ha'of is done in the airspace above the altar? Havi le yarud. If we assume that the avir of the mizbeach is lav kimizbeach, then he's already taken and removed the chatas ha'of from the mizbeach. And therefore, once he has taken it off the mizbeach, then since it's possible, we cannot put it back on the mizbeach. So how could it possibly be that we do the hazah of the chatas ha'of psula? And therefore, we have a valid proof that avir of the mizbeach, havi leikim mizbeach, has the same status as mizbeach, and therefore it's not a yarud situation, but rather it's on the mizbeach. And we could extend that question to shar psulim hechi zarek lahu midama. In other cases of, let's say, a zevach behema of an animal, not an oaf, how could we do the hazah of the dam, or I should say not hazah, I should be more precise and say the zrika of the dam? Once the carbon was brought on the mizbeach, the zrika implies that the kohen is holding on to a receptacle, and therefore the dam is now in the airspace above the mizbeach. So the Kohen now lifts up this receptacle, which is called a mizrak, and he wants to throw the dam, but it's already in the airspace of the mizbech, which means it's yarud. It's already outside the mizbech. Again, we have to prove from this the conclusion that avir mizbech mizbech. And the Gemara tries to suggest the magalahu, that maybe the case is where the Kohen is holding on to the chatas ha'of, or for that matter, the mizrak of the dam of the zevach behema, and he constantly keeps the chatas ha'of and the mizrach in contact with the walls of the mizbeach. So it never really left the mizbeach. It was always constantly attached to the mizbeach and never entered into the airspace of the mizbeach. So Gemara says, ha'azahu? Can you really consider that hazah as if he sprinkled something from a distance onto the mizbeach? What are you talking about? If you're holding the bird against, the wall of the mizbeach, then mitzrihi. That's not zrika. That's not hazah. He's simply doing a mitzri, which is a process by which you drain the bird of its dam, but there's no act of hazah. Or in the case of the mizrak, with regard to the dam of the zevach behema, hazrika. Can you consider this a zrika? Shvichahi. You cannot classify this and define it as zrika. He didn't throw it at a distance. Shvicha. Right, shvicha means when you have something attached to the mizbeach and you pour it onto the mizbeach, onto the koslei mizbeach. The ode, and not only that, this is a very unusual kind of scenario, such that derech hazah b'kach, derech zrika b'kach. This is not the derech, the normal way in which you do hazah, the normal way in which you do zrika. So even if I would grant you that these are not acts of shficha or of of um, of mitzui, but nevertheless, it certainly doesn't qualify as hazah or zrika because it's not the normal way you do it, and the avodah has to be done in the normal way. So again, we have to conclude based on these two proofs that the avir of the mizbeach is kimizbeach domi. It has the same status as mizbeach. Omer Ravashi, Ravashi again rejects it. If let's say the Kohen is standing on the Mizbeach, so his body is connected to the Mizbeach, and he's holding on to the Chatas Ha'of or to the Zevach Behema as he's standing on the Mizbeach. In such a case, for sure, that which he's holding is connected to the Mizbeach itself, even though it's not touching the actual Mizbeach, but it's connected to the Mizbeach. And therefore, anything being held in the hands of the Kohen who's standing on the Mizbeach is considered connected to the Mizbeach. And therefore, the Kohen could go ahead and do the Hazah or the Zrika. Kika Amar, but what was the question that we presented here as to whether or not the Avir of the Mizbeach has a status of Mizbeach? The Talinu Bekanya. It wasn't as if the Kohen was standing on the Mizbeach. He wasn't standing on the Mizbeach. He was standing on the ground, on the Azor, the Ritzvas Azor. He's holding on to that which has to have avoda and hakrova with a stick. And the Mefarshim explain that it doesn't have to be that he's holding it onto a stick. The Gemara is just giving an example of a stick. Because basically, how could he be standing on the ground and have something suspended over the Mizbeach, over the top of the Mizbeach? The Mizbeach was 10 amos high. So therefore, the Gemara comes up with this scenario of holding it with a stick. But again, the question of Avir addresses an issue where the Kohen is not standing on the ground of the Mizbeach, but rather on the ground of the Azor. Teku, my Teku. The Gemara says we don't have an answer to the question, so the issue of the status of the Avir Mizbeach remains an outstanding issue. And now we start the Mishnah here on Daf Peches. Now, by way of introduction, let's say that a Kli Shares has a unique power to be Makadesh, that which enters into the Kli Shares, for whatever purpose of Avodah it is designated. Now, there are two types of Kalim. There are what we call fluid, and there are solid. So the Mishnah says, Kli alach, if you have a Kli Shares, which is designated for fluids, like for example, the Mizrak that we spoke about before, where the dam, which is a liquid, goes into the Mizrak, is then Mekadshim es halach. That which is fluid will be subject to the kiddush of Kli Shares, that a Kli Shares could be Makadesh. Now, we're going to soon see that when the Kli Shares is Makadesh, there are two different, how do you say in English, Totzaot, two different results. One result is that once the Kiddush is Chal, then it could go on to the Mizbeach for the Avodah. The other result is just the opposite. That once there's kiddush, then it could be subject to all the different psulim, the disqualifications that apply to karbanos. However, if this kli, which is designated for fluids, would be used to measure solids, it would not be makadesh the solids that go into the kli. And in the flip case, ein kli alach makadesh, right? Ein kli, okay, that we saw already. And then umidas yavesh makadshos es hayavesh. Vi ein kli alach makadesh es hayavesh, v'lo yavesh makadesh es halach. Then they had kalim that were designated for the carbon mincha. The carbon mincha was made of soles of flour. The flour is dry, and it had to be measured out, isaron, etc., in order to prepare it for the carbon mincha. And that keli, which was designated for solids, to measure the solids, like, for example, the flour of mincha, that could be makadesh, the mincha that's put into the kli, the solid, but it would not be makadesh a liquid, like, for example, you need yayin l'nisuch hayayin al gav mizbeach. If the yayin goes into those kalim, which are called in the Mishnah midos yavesh, Tosfos has a whole discussion why the Mishnah changes its language. First, it starts with kli alach, and then it should have said kli yavesh, but instead it says midas yavesh, because the Mishnah wants to emphasize that these kalim are used for midos, midos meaning to measure out the solid, so that it be an isar and a precise volume of flour for the avodas hamincha. But if you would put a liquid into that kli which is designated for measuring solids, then the kli would not be makadesh the liquid. For example, yayin that we mentioned before. Kli HaKodesh Nikva. What's the status of a kli shores that was punctured? You know, there's a hole in the kli. Does it still maintain its status as a kli? The Mishnah says it depends. Im osim b'hemein malachtom shayu osim b'hemein shlemim. If it could still function because the hole is too small, but it does function in more or less the capacity that it was meant to function, then it still remains sholem, and it still has the status of a kli sharis, and it's makadesh that which goes into it. However, im lav, if the hole is so large that you can no longer use the kli in the function that it was meant to be, then ein makadshim. It doesn't have a status of a kli sharis. It cannot sanctify that which goes into it. V'kulon ein makadshim ela b'kodesh. Not only that, this entire process, which is the subject of the Mishnah, namely that which goes into the kli sharis is sanctified, that only applies within the azara. If the kli is in the azara, then it has the status of a kli sharis, and that which goes into it, a liquid into a liquid, a solid into a solid, it's makadesh. Omar Shmuel. Lo shanu elamidos, avol mizrakos mekadshim. When we say that if you use a kli sharis that's designated for dry volumes, for liquids, then it's not makadesh the fluids. That's true for those kalim that are designated exclusively only for solids. Avol mizrakos mekadshim. Mizrakos, which are used for the dam, which is a fluid, could nevertheless sanctify solids as well, because it's a basin, and a basin can be used both for liquids and for solids. And we're going to derive this from a pasuk. Shenemar, he tells you here that the pasuk is in Bamidbar, and it says Shneim Maleim Soles, which implies that the bowl and the basin which sanctified the flour for the menachos can be used Shneim. Shneim means for both the liquid and the solid. Now he points out here, based on a Gemara in Menachos, that there were 7 specific measures for liquid that were used in the Mikdash, and they're enumerated in the Gemara Menachos on Daf Pei Zayin. These kalim were sanctified through Shemen HaMishcha for the purpose of measuring, and therefore they're makadesh only substances that are measured inside of them. Solids cannot be measured in liquid measures, and these vessels cannot sanctify solids. However, the ordinary bowls and basins, although designed primarily for the dam, for the liquids, were equally fit to hold solids, and therefore these kalim would sanctify even solids that were put inside the kalim. Amalei Rav Achami Difteri Rafa. What is the proof from the pasuk Shneim Maleim Solis? Mincha lachahi. The mincha is considered lach. Why is the mincha lach? After all, we said it's flour. Flour is not a fluid, it's a solid. But the answer is he has to mix the shemen, the oil, in the solid, and now it becomes a liquid, which is called in the Gemara's language lacha. So now the pasuk referring to a korban mincha says Shnei Maleim Solis. But that solis is a mixture with shemen, and therefore it's liquid. So how does Shmuel, derive any conclusions about putting solids in there when it was a kli that was designated for liquids? So Ravina replies to Rav Acha's question, Lo nitzucha el yaveh sheba. Even though you pour the oil into the flour, there are always inevitably certain particles of the flour that do not mix with the oil, and they remain solid. And nevertheless, this kli, which is primarily used for liquids, because the mincha, as we said, is mixed with the oil and it becomes a liquid, nevertheless, it's makadesh even those particles of solids inside them. Iboy same another answer, mincha legabi dam ki yavesh dami. Even though it's true the mincha is mixed with oil, but that mixture still remains not lach, but yavesh. Why? Because if we compare it relatively to dam, dam is pure liquid. And the mincha, although it does have a mixture of liquid, is primarily solid, and therefore it has the status of yavesh. And the kiddush took place in that basin. It was a silver basin that was normally used for dam, but since the basin also has the capacity to be makadesh, the dense mixture of flour and oil, it must have the capacity to sanctify even an absolute solid. Omer Shmuel kli sharis emekachin el shleimim. Shmuel seems to be reiterating what we learned in the Mishnah, that if the kli has a hole in it, it no longer functions properly, therefore it's not a kli sharis, it's not mekadesh. Furthermore, and here Shmuel has a big chiddush, ein mekachin elam aleim. In other words, the amount that you need, let's say, for example, in a kli that's designated for measuring solids for a korban mincha. So the korban mincha requires either 2 isronos of flour or 1 isaron of flour. Let's say, for example, in a korban mincha, you need 1 isaron of flour. And Shmuel is saying that the sanctification, the kiddush of the kli could only apply when the entire isaron is placed into the kli. Now, there's another mincha which is called minchas nisachim, which is for yayin. There you need 3 esronos in the case of a par, or 2 esronos in the case of an ayil. So the different libations and nisuchim of yayin based on what the species of the animal is. Anything less than the required amount is not fit for the vessel, for the kli. The kli can only sanctify that which is fit when it's placed inside the kli. Furthermore, says Shmuel, Ein Makachin Elami Tochan. We'll see in the Gemara what that means, that somehow the Kiddush is only from the interior part of the kli. The Amrile, others have a different version of Shmuel. Ein Makachin El Shlemim Umaleim Umi Bifnim. My Beinayu. I mean, the second version is exactly identical to the first version. What are they arguing about? Ika Beinayu birutze midos. Now, birutze means that sometimes you put a certain measurement into a receptacle and then it overflows. It goes over the brim. Now, what's the status of that small amount that rests above the rim of the kli? According to the first Lishna, the kli is only makadesh that which is inside, in the interior airspace of the kli. According to the second Lishna, the kli is makadesh even that which is above the rim of the kli. And this, in fact, is a machlokes in the Gemara in Menachos on Daf Peches. From Asnis and Tana, we have a brayso that says Mekachin El Shlemim Umaleim Umitochon Ubifnim. Omar Avasi, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Shanu El She'ein Daito Lahosif. When do we say that if he didn't have the full amount, the full volume, then the kli is not makadesh? That's only because he had no intention to put more of a volume and add inside the kli. But if he was only measuring it out step by step, but his intention clearly was that he would eventually put into the kli the entire volume of the sorim, whatever it might be, that's necessary for the korban, then Rishon Kodesh, even though he places the volume successively, one after the other, small amounts, like, for example, a reva of an isar, and then he adds another reva, and so forth, so on, then it is mekadesh. And Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brayso to support this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, and it says Maleim, when the pasuk that we saw before says the word Maleim, Ein Maleim El Shlemim, or Rav Yossi Bisman Shein Daito Lahosif, Aval Daito Lahosif Rishon Kodesh. So I'm not exactly sure if Rav Yossi is arguing with the Tanna Kama. The impression I get at first reading is that Rav Yossi is only explaining the Tanna Kama. The Mishnah says, Ein Kli Alach Makadesh. It's not Makadesh that which is solid. Omar Rav V'Temer of Asi Ein Makadshim Li Korev Al Makadshim Li Posa. As we discussed earlier, there are two results of the Kli sanctifying that which is placed inside the Kli. One is that it prepares that which is inside the Kli for Hakrov Al Gavi Mizbeach. That's not going to function in a case where he puts Yavesh into a Kli Lach. However, even if he puts Yavesh into a Kli Lach, Makadshim Li Posel, there is a level of Kiddush which will be accomplished by the Kli Sharis, even though it's designated for Lach, and he puts in solid, and that is Li Posel. That if there's reason to passel it, for example, let's say he comes in contact with Tuma, with the Sheretz, then it will be possible. Normally, let's say you have Chulin, which is not designated for the Mizbeach, and it comes in contact with the Sheretz, nothing is lost. It doesn't disqualify that which is Chulin, but here it will become disqualified through the contact with a Dover HaMetame. He adds here that there's something called a Tful Yom. A Tful Yom is someone who's Tameh for one day, and he went to the mikveh before sunset, and his tara, his purification, is not complete until after nightfall, what's called heriv shemesh. So he can passel that which is kodesh if he comes in contact with something which is kodesh. And even though the solid was put into a kli sharis that's designated for liquids, nevertheless, if that solid food or substance would come in contact with a tful yom, it becomes possible. He also has another case called mechusa kapara, that's zav zav yoledis mitzora, if they didn't bring their carbon yet. Okay, we go on. Ikad de masli le'aha. Some say that the reference of Rav is to the following brisa. Ein meviyim menachos and esachim milchas behema bikurim min hameduma. Meduma is when you have a mixture of chulin and truma together. You don't know where the truma is in this mixture. So if you have, let's say, menachos, flour, which comes from any of the 5 species of grains, and those grains were meduma, then you can't bring it as a mincha. And the same is true for nesachim, which comes from yayin. And yayin is also one of these 7 species, and it is brought for nisuch hayayin. And there's a mitzvah of truma, to be mafresh truma mi dagon v'tirosh, tirosh meaning wine. And therefore, if the wine of truma got mixed up with wine of chulin, then you don't bring that as nisuch hayayin. And then you have a korban mincha which accompanies a zevach behema, and you have bikurim. In all these cases, you don't bring them from meduma, from a mixture of truma and chulin. V'yein tzarich lomer, it goes without saying, may orlo klaya keren. Right, we have a principle that mimashka Yisrael, we don't bring on the mizbeach that which is also beficha for us to eat, like kilayim or orla. Now, I'm not exactly sure why the brisa singles out orla and kilayim. Orla and kilayim are isurei hana. Orla mean the first 3 years of the produce of the fruit on the trees, and kilayim, which would be a mixture of grains and let's say other minim like legumes. Well, that might be okay, or fruits or grapes. Now, orla and kilayim are isurei hana. Now, we've already learned in the brisa that you can't bring on the mizbeach that which is meduma, which has a mixture of truma in it. So therefore, it goes without saying that if he brought on the mizbeach orla or kilayim, that would be forbidden. But I'm not sure why the brisa singles out Isurei Hana. That I don't chap that. V'im hevi lo kiddush, right? If he, let's say, he put orla or kilayim from into a klisharis or meduma for a mincha and so forth, then it's not makadesh. Omar Ravi Tamer Vasil Kiddishli Karvel Kiddishli Pasal, the same 2 dimensions that we discussed earlier. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, Klei Kodesh and Nikvu. If let's say you have a klisharis that was damaged and now it partially broken and it has a hole in it, Ein Matichin Osan, we don't take that hole and apply heat to that hole so that the metal now will be melted and could then be used, the melted metal could cover over the hole. And another possibility of closing up the hole would be to pour hot molten lead onto the hole. And these are processes that we don't do in order to be machshir a kli shores that has a breakage. So we cannot use these routine methods of repairing a puncture in a metal dish to melt the surrounding of the puncture and seal it up with molten lead. But what we can do is we could melt down the kli completely and form the kli anew. In other words, once the psul is chal, you cannot remove the psul. But what you can do is completely melt it down, and then we apply the principle called panim chadoshes bolakam. It's a brand new kli. Nifgimu, and this pagam is a damage in the kli. Ein mitaktin osan. We don't repair it. It lost its status as a klishores, and you could create it anew by melting it down, but that's all you could do. Sakin shenifkam, a knife that was nicked. Ein mashchizin es pkimos. We don't do ashchaza. Ashchaza is when you take the knife and you scrape it onto a hard substance like a stone in order to straighten out the nick. We don't do this. Nishmita. And even if you had a handle attached to a knife and the handle got detached from the knife, we don't reattach it. It's no longer klisharis. Emachzirnos. Abishol Omer, Sakin matrefes hoisa b'migdash, v'nimnu ole konim ugnazua. He reports a case in which there was a knife in the Beis HaMikdash that created tarfus. It means it had nicks in it. The shechita would not be machshir the animal, and they took a vote amongst the kohanim, and they decided, let's get rid of it. Tana Rabbanon, big day kahuna. Okay, now we start what we might call the main sugya for today, and that is, how do you create big day kahuna? And how do you repair big day kahuna? Or how do you cleanse big day kahuna if they got soiled? Which they probably did because the Kohanim were running around with the dam spritzing in all directions. And let's just quickly review Big Day Kahuna. There are 4 begadim that are worn by an ordinary Kohen, what we call a Kohen hedjot, Michnasayim, trousers, Ksones, a tunic that reached till the ground, and avnate, which is a belt, and mikbas, which is a turban. Those are the 4 worn by a Kohen Hedjot. Then the Kohen Gadol wore not only those 4, but an additional 4, totaling 8. And the additional 4 include the me'il, the choshen, the ephod, and the tzitz. So we'll get to that in more specific detail momentarily. Tana Rabbanon, big day kahuna ein osin oso ma'aseh machat. You don't use a needle to make the big day kahuna. You don't sew it. Ela ma'aseh oreg, you weave it. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, ma'aseh oreg nisgalu. If the big day kahuna became soiled, ein mechabsin. We don't use detergents to clean it. Lo beneser v'lo be'al. These are different types of very powerful detergents. So the Gemara is medayik from the price that ha b'mayim mechabsim. Does that mean that we could take the big day kahuna that is soiled and clean them with water, as long as we're not using these detergents? The Gemara thinks that that doesn't make much sense. Amar Abaye hochi kamar. Hugu b'mayim mechabsin oso b'neser v'ayil. If, let's say, the soil, the level, I'll call it, of soilage is such that you could clean the beged with water, you don't even need detergents, then you could even use detergents. Meaning the big day kahuna did not lose their status as big day kahuna by being soiled if that soilage can be removed simply by water without any detergent.